That seat isn't for people like you. Economy is back there. The words shot across the private terminal like bullets, deliberate and meant to wound. Alexander Blackwell didn't whisper them. He wanted everyone to hear to see him put this plainly dressed black woman in her place. What he didn't know was that in exactly 14 minutes, his entire family's legacy would crumble with just one decision from the woman he was trying to humiliate. The woman who owned not just the seat, but the entire jet he was about to board. The private terminal at Teterboro Airport was a cathedral of quiet wealth, a place where the air itself seemed filtered through money. Polished marble floors gleamed under soft, recessed lighting reflecting the silhouettes of travelers who had long ago stopped considering the cost of convenience. The scent of expensive leather and freshly brewed artisanal coffee hung in the spacious lounge, where everything from the ergonomic furniture to the handcrafted snacks whispered the same message: this space was not for everyone. It was a sanctuary for the privileged few, a bubble carefully constructed to insulate its patrons from the chaos of commercial travel. And in this sanctuary, Alexander Blackwell was holding court. Alexander stood tall at 42, his tailored Brioni suit hanging perfectly on his athletic frame. The son of Richard Blackwell, founder of Blackwell Industries, Alexander had inherited his father's striking features, but none of his business acumen. What he did inherit was an unwavering sense of entitlement, a belief that the world existed to accommodate him. His carefully styled, gray-streaked hair and manicured nails were advertisements of his meticulous self-image, and the platinum watch on his wrist, a limited edition Patek Philippe, cost more than what most people earned in 5 years. "Look at this place," he said, voice deliberately loud enough to carry across the quiet terminal. "You pay a fortune for privacy, and they still let just anyone wander in." Victoria Foster, his girlfriend of 8 months, released a practiced laugh. At 35, she had perfected the art of being decorative. Her white Chanel blazer was pristine, her blonde hair arranged in waves that looked effortless but had taken her stylist 2 hours that morning. Her makeup emphasized wide blue eyes and full lips that now curved into an amused smile at Alexander's comment. "Don't be dramatic, darling," she said, though her eyes scanned the lounge with the same dismissive assessment. "It's probably just a charter mix-up, or someone's assistant." Alexander's attention had fixed on a woman sitting alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was engrossed in a thick, dog-eared paperback, her expression one of calm concentration. She wore simple, comfortable-looking gray travel pants, a soft navy blue sweater, and practical flat shoes. Her hair was styled in elegant, intricate braids that fell over her shoulder. To Alexander, her entire presence was an affront, a smudge on the pristine canvas of his exclusive experience. She didn't belong here. Alexander Blackwell had never known a world that didn't bend to his will. His life was a series of seamless transitions from one luxurious bubble to another: the penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, the corner office with panoramic views of Manhattan, the summer home in the Hamptons, and this, the leased Gulfstream G650 waiting on the tarmac to whisk him and Victoria to a weekend of skiing in Aspen. "Look at her," Alexander muttered to Victoria, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still perfectly audible to anyone within 10 feet. "Reading a book, a physical book. How quaint. Probably a freebie from the airport gift shop." Victoria giggled, leaning into him. "Maybe she won a contest. Be a billionaire for a day. First prize is a flight to Aspen. Second prize is 2 flights to Newark." Their laughter, sharp and cruel, cut through the quiet hum of the lounge. The woman didn't look up from her book, but a subtle tension in her shoulders suggested she had heard them. She simply turned a page, her focus seemingly unbroken. This infuriated Alexander even more. His power, his very presence, was built on being acknowledged, feared, or at the very least noticed. To be ignored by someone he deemed so far beneath him was an insult he couldn't tolerate. Her name was Naomi Reynolds, and while Alexander Blackwell had been born on third base, convinced he'd hit a triple, Naomi had built the entire stadium from scratch. She was the founder and CEO of Horizon Innovations, a revolutionary green technology firm that was single-handedly disrupting the global energy sector. Her company's patented carbon capture technology and hyper-efficient solar materials were poised to change the world. Fortune magazine had dubbed her the quiet architect of tomorrow. She was a billionaire several times over, but she wore her wealth like a well-tailored invisible coat. It was there for her own comfort and purpose, not for public display. She was flying to Aspen to visit Professor Thomas Blackwood, her former physics professor and mentor, who was in the final stages of a battle with cancer. It was a personal, somber trip, and she had dressed for comfort, not for an audience. The book she was reading was a worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, a gift from Blackwood years ago when she was a struggling graduate student. Its stoic wisdom was a balm for her anxious heart, as she prepared to say goodbye to the man who had believed in her when no one else had. Have you ever been judged by your appearance, by the clothes you wear, or the color of your skin? Drop a comment below and share your experience. And if you believe everyone deserves dignity and respect, regardless of how they look, hit that subscribe button and join our community of storytellers seeking justice through truth. Now let's see what happens when assumptions meet reality. When the power someone thinks they hold collides with the power someone actually possesses. What the passengers in the private terminal couldn't see, what Alexander Blackwell couldn't begin to imagine, was the empire Naomi Reynolds had built through sheer brilliance and determination. At 38, Naomi had revolutionized the energy sector with breakthrough technology that captured carbon at a fraction of the cost of previous methods. Horizon Innovations, the company she founded in her garage 10 years ago, now employed over 5,000 people across 3 continents and was valued at $28 billion. Her patents formed the backbone of a green revolution that had energy giants scrambling to adapt or die. But unlike many of her Silicon Valley counterparts, Naomi eschewed the spotlight. She gave few interviews, appeared at select conferences, and focused on the work rather than the accolades. The rare profiles written about her often mentioned her stealth wealth, her preference for practical high-quality clothes over designer labels, her modest home in a suburb of Boston, and her commitment to living simply despite her immense fortune. She had grown up in Baltimore, the daughter of a high school math teacher and a nurse. From an early age, she'd shown extraordinary aptitude for science and mathematics, earning scholarships that took her to MIT, where she met Professor Thomas Blackwood. He recognized not just her intelligence, but her visionary thinking, becoming her mentor, and eventually an early investor in Horizon Innovations. The path hadn't been easy. As a Black woman in STEM, Naomi had faced countless moments like the one unfolding in the private terminal, assumptions, dismissals, and outright hostility. During her undergraduate years, a professor had once handed back her perfect exam paper with a comment, "See me after class. I don't tolerate cheating." It took 3 hours of interrogation and a repeat test, which she aced again, before he grudgingly accepted her brilliance. One incident stood out in her memory with particular clarity. During her second year of doctoral studies, she'd developed a promising approach to carbon capture that challenged the prevailing models. When she presented her findings at a departmental colloquium, the senior professor who was supposed to provide feedback had barely looked at her work. Instead, he'd asked her if she was sure she was in the right program and suggested that perhaps social sciences would be a better fit. The room had gone silent, the implicit bias hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. It was Professor Blackwood who had stood up that day. With calm precision, he had dissected her research point by point, highlighting its innovation and mathematical elegance. When he finished, he had looked directly at his colleague and said, "Ms. Reynolds isn't just in the right program. She's redefining it. One day, the rest of you will be studying her methods." Blackwood's intervention hadn't just salvaged her presentation, it had changed the trajectory of her career. From that day forward, she'd stopped trying to fit into spaces that weren't designed for her and began building her own. At 25, she'd pitched her initial carbon capture concept to a room of venture capitalists, only to be asked if she was the assistant and when the actual scientist would arrive. She had calmly placed her MIT doctorate on the table and proceeded with her presentation. Most of them declined to invest a decision they would later regret when Horizon Innovations became the fastest-growing clean energy company in history. These experiences had forged in Naomi a particular kind of strength, not the loud, brash confidence of Alexander Blackwell, but something more durable. She had learned to measure her worth not by others' recognition, but by the impact of her work. She had also developed a keen eye for character, particularly for distinguishing between those who saw people as means to ends and those who saw the inherent value in every human being. It was this discernment that had led her to consider acquiring Blackwell Industries. The company had valuable manufacturing infrastructure that could accelerate Horizon's production of next-generation solar panels. Their engineering team had a solid reputation despite the company's financial troubles. But Naomi had serious reservations about the corporate culture concerns that had been reinforced by preliminary discussions with Richard Blackwell. The elder Blackwell was brilliant, but from another era, one where executives expected deference and employees were interchangeable parts in the corporate machine. In their meetings, he had repeatedly referred to his workforce as bodies and spoke about personnel issues as necessary disciplinary actions. These were red flags to Naomi, whose own company culture centered on respect and collaboration. Now, Professor Blackwood was dying. Pancreatic cancer stage 4. When he called asking to see her one last time at his home in Aspen, she rearranged her entire schedule. Some things mattered more than business, and she owed this man everything. Their relationship had transcended the typical professor-student dynamic years ago. Thomas Blackwood had become the father figure Naomi had lost when she was 16. Her biological father, James Reynolds, had died suddenly of an aneurysm, leaving her mother to raise Naomi and her 2 younger siblings alone. Through those difficult years, it was her father's belief in education that kept Naomi focused on her studies, eventually earning her a full scholarship to MIT. There she met Blackwood, whose introductory physics class had a fearsome reputation among freshmen. But where others saw an intimidating professor, Naomi found a kindred spirit who valued questions more than answers. After she challenged one of his assertions during a lecture, he had invited her to his office hours not to reprimand her, but to discuss her alternative hypothesis. It was the beginning of a mentorship that would shape both their lives. Blackwood guided her through academic challenges, connected her with research opportunities, and eventually supported her doctoral work on carbon capture technology. When she graduated, he had handed her a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations with a note inscribed inside. Remember that true power lies not in controlling others, but in mastering yourself. Years later, when she founded Horizon Innovations, Blackwood was her first investor, contributing his entire retirement fund, $150,000, to her seed round. She had protested, knowing the risk, but he had waved away her concerns. "If I'm wrong about you," he'd said, "then I've been wrong about everything in my life, and the money won't matter anyway." She had paid him back tenfold within 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was flying to see her mentor while simultaneously considering whether to acquire Blackwell Industries, a once mighty manufacturing conglomerate that had failed to innovate and was now bleeding cash. The acquisition would give Horizon access to manufacturing facilities they needed for expansion, but reports about the company culture gave her pause. Still, she had agreed to meet with the board after visiting Professor Blackwood, and the preliminary paperwork was already being prepared by her legal team. What she didn't know until this moment was that Alexander Blackwell, the founder's son and current executive vice president, would be such a perfect representation of everything she hesitated about regarding the company's values. A uniformed attendant approached Alexander and Victoria. "Mr. Blackwell, your aircraft is ready for boarding." Alexander stood stretching with an air of theatrical importance. "It's about time," he said, handing his briefcase to the attendant as if it were a royal scepter. He glanced one last time at Naomi. Let's hope we don't have to share the cabin with the competition winner. As they walked toward the glass doors leading to the tarmac, Naomi finally looked up. Her eyes, deep and intelligent, followed them for a moment. There was no anger in her gaze, only a quiet, weary assessment. It was a look she was all too familiar with, the casual dismissal, the snap judgment based on her race, her gender, her unassuming clothes. For years it had fueled her ambition. Now it just made her tired. She sighed, placed a thin leather bookmark between the pages, and closed her book. She stood up, her movements fluid and unhurried. Another attendant approached her with a deferential nod. "Ms. Reynolds, we're ready whenever you are. Captain Rodriguez has the flight plan filed, and we're just waiting for you." "Thank you, Michael," Naomi said, her voice calm and melodic. "I'm ready now." She walked toward the same glass doors, her path set on a collision course with the Blackwells, who were busy taking selfies on the tarmac in front of the gleaming white jet. Alexander, a self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face, was completely oblivious to the fact that the woman he had just mocked wasn't just another passenger. She was the one who owned the plane. Michael, the attendant, had worked for Naomi for 3 years. He had started as ground crew washing and maintaining Horizon 1. Within 6 months, Naomi had noticed his exceptional attention to detail and promoted him to flight attendant. Unlike many executives, she knew the names of every crew member, asked about their families, and treated them with the same respect she showed her board of directors. When Michael's son had been diagnosed with leukemia last year, Naomi had arranged for the best oncologists and covered all expenses not included in his health insurance. She didn't publicize such acts. She simply considered them part of her responsibility to the people who worked for her. It was one of many reasons her employees showed her genuine loyalty rather than fear-based deference. The interior of the Gulfstream G650, which Naomi had personally christened Horizon 1, was a masterpiece of understated luxury. The cabin was configured for 8 passengers with plush, cream-colored leather seats, polished dark walnut trim, and soft, indirect lighting that created a serene, calming ambiance. A fully stocked galley gleamed at the front, and a private stateroom was situated at the rear. Every detail, from the thread count of the cashmere blankets to the weight of the crystal glasses, had been chosen by Naomi herself. It was her sanctuary in the sky, a place for work reflection and quiet transit between the responsibilities that defined her life. Alexander Blackwell, however, treated it like a newly conquered territory. He tossed his jacket onto one seat, plopped into another, and immediately began barking orders at the flight attendant, a poised and professional woman named Jasmine Torres. "I'll have a Macallan 25. Neat. And make sure the ice is in a separate glass. I hate it when it gets watered down. Victoria, what do you want, darling? Champagne? Get her the best you have. Dom Perignon, preferably." "Of course, Mr. Blackwell," Jasmine replied, her smile tight but unwavering. "We have a Dom Perignon 2008 on board." "Fine, that will have to do," Alexander said with a sigh of immense suffering. Victoria settled into the seat opposite him, already scrolling through her phone, no doubt crafting the perfect Instagram caption for the selfie she'd just taken. The two of them were an island of noisy entitlement in the otherwise tranquil cabin. Jasmine Torres had been with Horizon Aviation, the subsidiary that managed Naomi's private jet, for 5 years. Like Michael, she had stories about Naomi's quiet generosity. When Jasmine's mother needed specialized heart surgery, Naomi had made a call to a leading cardiologist who happened to be on Horizon Innovation's advisory board. When Jasmine mentioned her son's interest in engineering, Naomi had personally arranged for him to tour the Horizon research facilities and meet with senior engineers. These weren't calculated acts of noblesse oblige. They were simply the way Naomi moved through the world. She understood that true power lay not in making others feel small, but in helping them recognize their own greatness. It was a philosophy directly opposed to Alexander Blackwell's approach to life. Have you ever witnessed someone make assumptions that came back to haunt them? Those moments when arrogance meets reality and the tables turn in an instant. Share your stories in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this journey of justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories that remind us of the power of dignity. Now let's get back to what happens when Alexander's sense of superiority collides with Naomi's quiet strength. Alexander Blackwell believed the world existed to serve him, and he treated the flight crew accordingly. More ice, he demanded, rattling his already half-empty scotch glass without looking up at Jasmine. And tell the pilot I'd prefer to take the northern route. Less turbulence. Jasmine maintained her professional composure. I'll let Captain Rodriguez know your preference, sir, but the flight plan has been filed based on weather patterns and air traffic control recommendations. Alexander waved his hand dismissively. Just tell him. I fly often enough to know the better routes. Victoria, meanwhile, had transformed their section of the cabin into a mobile photo studio. She posed with her champagne flute angling her face to catch the light in a way that suggested candid delight rather than carefully orchestrated self-promotion. Babe, get one of me looking out the window. Contemplative but glamorous. Hashtag private jet life. Alexander obliged, snapping several photos while giving specific directions. Chin down a bit. Look more relaxed, but expensive. There you go. A distinguished older gentleman seated a few rows back watched this display with quiet disapproval. Ambassador Thomas Wilson had spent 4 decades in diplomatic service representing American interests in countries across Europe and Asia. He had negotiated with dictators, calmed volatile political situations, and always maintained his dignity. Now, in his late 60s, he served on several corporate boards while mentoring young diplomats. He had been invited to Aspen for a climate policy roundtable and had accepted Naomi's offer of transportation after meeting her at a United Nations summit the previous year. Their performative wealth routine was interrupted by movement at the cabin door. Naomi Reynolds stepped onto the aircraft. She gave Jasmine a warm smile and a brief hug, a gesture that caught Alexander's attention immediately. Good to see you, Jasmine. How's your son doing with his college applications? Submitted his last one yesterday, Ms. Reynolds. Thanks again for having your assistant look over his essays. Anytime. That's what the Horizon Scholarship Program is for, finding talent everywhere. The familiarity between them was obvious, as was the genuine respect in Jasmine's voice. Alexander's brow furrowed as he observed the interaction. When Naomi moved toward a seat in the main cabin area, he couldn't contain himself any longer. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "You seem to be confused. This is a private flight." Naomi looked at him with calm eyes. "Yes, it is." Alexander's jaw tightened. He stood using his height to tower over her. "These seats," he gestured around the main cabin, "are for actual guests, not the help. I'm not sure how you got past security, but the staff area is in the back." Victoria looked up from her phone, her eyes widening slightly at the confrontation, but her lips curving in amusement. Naomi didn't move. "I'm exactly where I belong." The simple statement, delivered without heat or defensiveness, seemed to ignite something in Alexander. His face flushed and his voice rose. "Listen, I don't know if you're someone's assistant or if there's been a booking error, but this is a private jet chartered by Blackwell Industries. These seats," he gestured more emphatically, "are for executives and their guests. Not for," he looked her up and down, "random passengers." Jasmine stepped forward, alarm evident in her expression. "Sir!" There's Alexander cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Don't worry, I'll handle this." He turned back to Naomi. "Those clothes might get you into economy on a commercial flight, but this is a different level. Now please move to the appropriate section or deplane." Victoria had set down her phone, now fully engaged in the drama. "Alex, darling, maybe she's with the catering staff. Or perhaps she's the flight attendant's assistant." Naomi still hadn't moved, her expression unchanged except for a slight tightening around her eyes. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice level, "I understand you believe you're in charge here. But you're mistaken. About several things." Alexander's face darkened. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone he deemed irrelevant. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded, his voice rising further. "I'm Alexander Blackwell, Executive Vice President of Blackwell Industries. My father built one of the largest manufacturing companies in the country." Naomi nodded slightly. "Yes, I know exactly who you are." From a nearby seat, an older gentleman cleared his throat. He had been quietly observing the escalating situation with growing disapproval. He was in his late 60s, distinguished-looking, with silver hair and an impeccable suit. Ambassador Thomas Wilson had spent decades in diplomatic service and recognized the dangerous combination of power and ignorance when he saw it. "Young man," he said, voice steady despite his age, "I've been flying private for 40 years and I've never seen someone behave with such poor taste." Alexander barely glanced at him. "Mind your own business, old man. Civility is everyone's business," Ambassador Wilson replied, nodding respectfully toward Naomi. "My apologies, ma'am, for having to witness this behavior." Alexander's face flushed deeper. He turned to Jasmine, who stood frozen near the galley. "Call security. This woman is trespassing on a private flight and this old man is interfering." Jasmine's eyes flicked nervously between Alexander and Naomi. "Sir, I can't do that." "What do you mean you can't?" "I'm telling you to remove these people from my flight." The tension in the cabin was palpable now. Two other passengers, business associates of Naomi's who had boarded earlier, watched with growing concern. One of them, Dr. Elena Vasquez Horizon's chief research officer, began to rise from her seat, but Naomi gave her a subtle hand signal to stay put. It was at this moment that Naomi finally reached for her phone. She pressed a single button and spoke quietly. "Julian, we may need to delay takeoff by a few minutes." "Yes, it's happening again." Alexander sneered. "Calling for backup. Trust me, it won't help. This is my flight, and I decide who stays and who goes." Victoria stood now, moving to Alexander's side in a show of solidarity. "Honestly, this is getting ridiculous. We have dinner reservations in Aspen." Naomi ended her call and finally turned her full attention to Alexander. Her voice remained calm, but there was a new firmness to it. "Mr. Blackwell, I've been patient because I understand the power of first impressions and hasty judgments, but your behavior has crossed a line from merely rude to actively hostile, and I cannot allow that on my aircraft." "Your aircraft," Victoria echoed, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "What are you talking about?" Alexander's confidence wavered for just a second before he doubled down. "That's absurd. This jet is leased by Blackwell Industries for executive travel. I have the paperwork." "No, Mr. Blackwell," Naomi replied. "You have an invitation to fly on my personal aircraft as a courtesy extended to potential business partners." "An invitation I'm now reconsidering." Alexander's face cycled through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, confusion, anger. He wasn't accustomed to losing control of a situation, especially not to someone he had already dismissed as irrelevant. "Look," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, "there's clearly been some miscommunication. My father arranged this transportation personally with the leasing company." "I don't know what you've been told, but I own the leasing company," Naomi interrupted quietly. "Horizon Aviation is a subsidiary of Horizon Innovations. This particular aircraft, Horizon 1, is my personal jet, not part of the corporate fleet." Alexander's mouth opened, then closed without a sound. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he found himself speechless. Victoria took a small step away from him, her loyalty already evaporating in the heat of potential humiliation. The revelation hung in the air. Captain Rodriguez chose this moment to emerge from the cockpit, creating a subtle but significant reinforcement of where the true authority on this aircraft lay. "Miss Reynolds," he said with a deferential nod. "We're third in the departure queue. Is everything all right?" A small ripple of whispers moved through the cabin as the few other passengers registered what was happening. Dr. Vasquez, still seated but watching intently, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Ambassador Wilson leaned back in his seat, observing the unfolding drama with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed countless power shifts during his diplomatic career. For a moment, no one spoke. It was as if time had suspended itself, waiting to see which way the balance would tip. Alexander stood frozen, his brain struggling to recalibrate everything he thought he knew about the situation. After exactly 7 minutes since Naomi had boarded the plane, 7 minutes of Alexander's increasing hostility, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. The easy arrogance that had propelled Alexander's behavior was crumbling visibly like a sand castle against an incoming tide. Naomi, however, remained perfectly composed. She had faced versions of this scenario throughout her life and career moments when people who had underestimated her suddenly realized their mistake. Such moments no longer gave her satisfaction. They simply reinforced her understanding of how superficial most judgments truly were. The tension is building. What would you do in Naomi's situation? Would you reveal your power immediately, or would you let someone show their true colors first? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in the importance of treating everyone with respect regardless of appearance, hit that subscribe button. Now watch as the power dynamic is about to completely reverse. The cabin door to the cockpit opened and Captain Rodriguez stepped out, tablet in hand. He was a seasoned pilot in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of someone who had logged thousands of flight hours. "Ms. Reynolds," he said with a respectful nod, "your weather report shows clear skies all the way to Aspen. We should have a smooth flight once we're cleared for takeoff." Alexander's eyes darted between Naomi and the captain. "Your weather report." The emphasis on your hung in the air like a sudden change in pressure. Something was happening that Alexander couldn't quite grasp, a shift in reality that his mind resisted processing. Naomi nodded to the captain. "Thank you, Rodriguez. Give me a few minutes to resolve this situation and then we'll be ready to depart." "Yes, ma'am," the captain replied before retreating to the cockpit. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Alexander's expression had shifted from outrage to confusion, his certainty visibly crumbling. Victoria had gone very still, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips. Naomi took a slow, deliberate breath before addressing Alexander directly. "Mr. Blackwell, this isn't a chartered flight where you're the client," she said evenly. "This is my personal aircraft. I own Horizon One outright. I named her, designed her interior, and hired every member of her crew." Alexander's face drained of color, then flushed crimson in rapid succession. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. His hands, which had been gesturing confidently just moments ago, now hung awkwardly at his sides, then began to tremble visibly. The tremor traveled up his arms, a physical manifestation of his collapsing worldview. That's impossible," he finally managed. "This is a Gulfstream G650. It costs—" "I'm well aware of the cost," Naomi interrupted gently. "I purchased it 3 years ago when Horizon Innovations expanded internationally." Alexander's hands began to tremble uncontrollably now. Not just a slight shake, but violent enough that scotch sloshed over the rim of his crystal glass, staining his custom shirt sleeve. The drops of condensation fell to the floor like his family's future prospects, scattering in real time. The tremor traveled visibly up his arms to his shoulders as the full realization dawned on him. He wasn't just facing a random passenger, he was standing before Naomi Reynolds, the very woman who held his family's future in her hands. Alexander's eyes darted around the cabin, desperately seeking some anchor for his unraveling reality. He noticed for the first time the subtle H monogram on the napkins, the custom green accent trim that matched Horizon Innovations' corporate color. Details that had been there all along, but that he had been too self-absorbed to observe. Victoria slowly set her champagne down her perfectly manicured fingers, trembling slightly. She was already calculating the social damage of this encounter, already planning her exit strategy. There must be some mistake, Alexander insisted, though his voice had lost its commanding edge. My father arranged this flight personally. He knows the owner. Jasmine, who had been watching the exchange with carefully concealed satisfaction, now stepped forward. Mr. Blackwell, Ms. Reynolds is the owner. And yes, your father did arrange this flight with her as a courtesy while you're both in Aspen. The glass in Alexander's hand, crystal hand-blown, selected personally by Naomi during a trip to Venice, shook so violently that more scotch sloshed over the rim, staining the cuff of his bespoke shirt. The dark amber liquid spread like a slow-motion disaster, a physical metaphor for his unraveling situation. Alexander's world was tilting on its axis. He groped for the back of a seat to steady himself as realization dawned. The ice cubes in his drink clinked against the glass, creating a sound like tiny alarm bells. You're Naomi Reynolds of Horizon Innovations. The name came out strangled, as if his throat had constricted around the syllables. The implications were cascading through his mind, each one worse than the last. Naomi inclined her head slightly. I am. Ambassador Wilson, who had remained a silent observer, now allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Perhaps introductions would have been wise before accusations, Mr. Blackwell, he commented. His diplomatic career had taught him that true power rarely announced itself. It didn't need to. And he had recognized Naomi Reynolds immediately, having served with her on a climate change advisory panel for the State Department. He had watched her quiet authority command rooms full of politicians and business leaders, all without raising her voice or making a single demand. Victoria had recovered enough to attempt damage control. She stepped forward, hand extended, a brilliant smile fixed on her face. Ms. Reynolds, please forgive this terrible misunderstanding. Alexander is under tremendous pressure with the negotiations, and Naomi held up a hand, stopping Victoria mid-sentence. This wasn't a misunderstanding, Ms. Foster. It was a deliberate choice to judge someone based on appearance, and to treat them as lesser because of those judgments. Victoria's smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. She took another step away from Alexander, the distance between them now obvious to everyone in the cabin. Alexander had gone pale again, as the full implications hit him. Not only had he insulted the owner of the plane, but he had also humiliated himself in front of Naomi Reynolds, the CEO, whose company was in talks to acquire Blackwell Industries in a deal that would save his family's failing business. His father had desperately pursued this acquisition for months. It was the deal they planned to finalize in Aspen. This was their lifeline. Without it, their over-leveraged company faced imminent bankruptcy. His mind raced, trying to find some way to salvage the situation. It was what he had always done, charm his way out of trouble. Use his family name as a shield, find someone else to blame for his mistakes. But this time, there was nowhere to hide. He had created this disaster entirely on his own, with an audience of witnesses who would remember every word, every gesture. The financial implications alone were staggering. Blackwell Industries was on the verge of collapse. Their stock had plummeted 40% over the past year. 3 banks had called in major loans. Without the Horizon acquisition, they would be forced into bankruptcy within months. Thousands of jobs would be lost. His father's legacy would end in disgrace, and it would all be because Alexander couldn't resist putting a woman in her place. Ms. Reynolds, he began, his voice now uncharacteristically humble. I had no idea. Please accept my deepest apologies for this unfortunate incident. If I had known who you were. That's exactly the problem, Mr. Blackwell. Naomi cut in, her voice still calm but firm. You believe respect should be based on status rather than inherent to each person. You would have treated me differently if you had known I was a CEO, but that doesn't make your behavior any less revealing. At this moment, exactly 9 minutes since Naomi had boarded, Alexander realized that his behavior hadn't just created a social embarrassment. It had potentially destroyed his family's company, and judging by the steady, unflinching way Naomi Reynolds was looking at him, she was fully aware of this fact. Alexander swallowed hard. His hands, usually so steady when signing contracts or holding expensive drinks, now trembled slightly at his sides. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cabin's perfect temperature control. "We've been in negotiations for weeks," he said, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "Our teams have been working around the clock on the merger details. This one incident shouldn't derail a beneficial business arrangement." He was grasping now, trying to separate his personal behavior from the business deal as if they existed in different universes. It was the same compartmentalization that had allowed him to bully subordinates and then give speeches about company values, to cheat on partners, and then present himself as a man of integrity. Naomi regarded him thoughtfully. "Business is ultimately about relationships, Mr. Blackwell, about trust and shared values. What I've witnessed today tells me everything I need to know about how you would treat my employees if your family remained in leadership positions after an acquisition." Her words were measured calm, but they fell like hammer blows. With each sentence, Alexander felt his future, the one he had taken for granted his entire life, crumbling around him. Ambassador Wilson nodded in agreement. "Young man character is how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you. You've shown yours quite clearly today." The ambassador's words carried the weight of decades of observation. He had seen countless powerful figures revealed by small moments, dictators who were cruel to servants, politicians who changed personalities depending on who was watching, business leaders who treated people as disposable resources. Victoria, sensing the catastrophe unfolding, stepped away from Alexander, creating physical distance between them. "Ms. Reynolds," she said quietly, "not all of us at Blackwell Industries share Alexander's perspective. Many of us would welcome Horizon's approach to business." Alexander shot her a look of betrayal, but Victoria avoided his eyes. She was already calculating her next career move if Blackwell Industries collapsed. She had never loved Alexander, had always seen him as a convenient stepping stone in her own social climbing, and now he had become a liability rather than an asset. In that moment, Alexander understood with perfect clarity that he stood completely alone. Victoria would abandon him. His father would blame him. The board would sacrifice him. And all because he couldn't resist the urge to put someone in their place, someone who, it turned out, occupied a place far above his own. 12 minutes had passed since Naomi boarded the plane. 12 minutes in which Alexander had revealed his character so completely that no amount of backpedaling could erase the impression. In 2 more minutes, the final verdict would be delivered. The tables have turned. Now what would you do with this power? Would you give someone a second chance after they've shown their true colors? Or would you protect your company from toxic leadership? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's see how Naomi handles this moment of truth. Naomi stood in the center of the cabin, the stillness about her a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence surrounding Alexander. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and measured. "Mr. Blackwell, please gather your belongings." The simple request hung in the air. Alexander stared at her, disbelief etched across his features. "You're throwing me off the plane." His voice cracked on the last word, a sound so foreign to his own ears that he barely recognized it as his. Alexander Blackwell didn't get thrown out of places. He was the one who determined who belonged and who didn't. The reversal was so complete, so perfect in its symmetry, that it seemed almost scripted by some cosmic force. "I'm asking you to leave my personal aircraft." "Yes. I cannot in good conscience continue our business discussions after witnessing your behavior. It violates the core values of Horizon Innovations." Alexander's desperation was palpable now. He stepped toward her, hands outstretched in supplication. Gone was the commanding posture, the easy authority. His body language had transformed completely, shrinking into itself as if he could physically diminish the impact of his actions. "Ms. Reynolds, please. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know who you were." "If I had." "That's precisely the problem," Naomi repeated. "You believe respect is something to be earned through status, rather than a basic courtesy extended to all people. That fundamental difference in values makes us incompatible as business partners." Victoria had already begun gathering her things, her movements quick and efficient as she distanced herself from the sinking ship that was Alexander's career. She wouldn't go down with him. She hadn't signed up for that. Alexander's face contorted with panic. The full implications were crashing down on him now, a tsunami of consequences that threatened to sweep away everything he had taken for granted. "You don't understand what's at stake. This acquisition is vital for Blackwell Industries. We employ thousands of people. My father's legacy." "I understand perfectly well what's at stake," Naomi replied. "I've reviewed your company's financials in detail. I know about the leveraged debt, the failed product launches, the declining market share. I came to Aspen prepared to finalize the acquisition despite concerns about your company culture." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, broken only by the soft hum of the aircraft's ventilation system. "But I believe how leaders behave when they think no one of consequence is watching reveals the true nature of an organization. You've shown me what I needed to know." Alexander's desperation turned to anger, his default emotion when cornered. His hands clenched into fists, then released, then clenched again as he fought to control himself. Even now, even as everything crumbled, some part of him recognized that lashing out would only make things worse. "This is ridiculous. You're basing a multi-billion-dollar business decision on one personal interaction. That's not rational business practice." His voice had risen again, revealing the entitlement that no amount of desperation could fully suppress. He still believed on some fundamental level that he should be exempt from the consequences of his actions. Ambassador Wilson cleared his throat. "On the contrary, young man, it's the most rational approach I've seen in decades of international business. Ms. Reynolds is evaluating the character of leadership, the most accurate predictor of long-term success." The ambassador's calm appraisal cut through Alexander's protestations like a scalpel. This wasn't just Naomi's judgment. It was the assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating leaders and systems. Victoria had finished gathering her things and now stood by the door as far from Alexander as the cabin allowed. Her eyes were downcast embarrassment radiating from her tense posture. "Alexander, please," she murmured. "Let's just go." But Alexander couldn't accept defeat. He had never had to before. Throughout his life, there had always been a way out, always someone to bail him out, always a path back to privilege. He made one final desperate attempt. "My father, Richard Blackwell. He's counting on this deal. He's not well. His heart. The stress of bankruptcy would kill him. You can't do this to him because of my mistake." He was playing his last card, appealing to Naomi's compassion, trying to shift responsibility, leveraging his father's health as an emotional shield. It was manipulation wrapped in desperation, and everyone in the cabin recognized it for what it was. Naomi's expression softened slightly, the first change in her composed demeanor. But it wasn't capitulation. It was recognition of the human cost beyond Alexander himself. "I have great respect for your father's accomplishments, Mr. Blackwell. He built something remarkable. But he also raised a son who believes it's acceptable to humiliate people he perceives as beneath him. That speaks to the values that ultimately shape a company's culture." Her words were gentle but unflinching, delivered with the clarity of someone who understood that true compassion sometimes required difficult decisions. She turned to Jasmine. "Please arrange for Mr. Blackwell and Ms. Foster to be escorted from the aircraft and provided with commercial flight options to Aspen." Alexander stood frozen, the full impact of her words washing over him. In less than 15 minutes, he had destroyed not only his own future, but potentially his family's entire legacy. 14 minutes and 30 seconds had passed since Naomi boarded exactly as the opening of our story foretold. Victoria touched his arm gently. "Alex, we need to go. The sooner we leave, the sooner they can depart." Her voice was soft but firm, a subtle distancing that presaged the complete separation to come. Already she was thinking of how to frame this story to mutual acquaintances, how to position herself as an innocent bystander rather than a willing participant. Her words seemed to break his trance. He gathered his jacket and briefcase with mechanical movements, his earlier swagger replaced by the stiff motions of a man in shock. The reality was setting in now. He was being removed from a private jet one his family didn't own by a woman he had tried to humiliate. And with his ejection went the last hope for Blackwell Industries. As they moved toward the door, Naomi spoke one final time. "Mr. Blackwell, this isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. I hope you find a path forward that helps you understand the difference." Alexander didn't respond. He couldn't. The words stuck in his throat as he descended the stairs to the tarmac, the weight of consequences pressing down on him like a physical force. On the tarmac, the February air bit through his expensive suit, designed for appearance rather than warmth like so much else in his life. The cold was clarifying a physical counterpoint to the numbness spreading through him. Victoria walked several paces ahead, already creating the narrative of separation, already moving on. Behind them, the gleaming white Gulf Stream, Naomi's Horizon 1, stood in stark contrast to the gray sky, a symbol of the power he had failed to recognize until it was too late. As they entered the terminal building, Alexander turned back for one last look. Through the jet's window, he could see Naomi returning to her seat, reopening her book with the same calm focus he had mocked earlier. The aircraft door closed with a finality that echoed in his bones. Victoria was already on her phone arranging alternative transportation. She didn't look at him as she spoke. "I'm going to take the commercial flight to Aspen. I still have meetings there." The unspoken part was clear meetings that didn't include him. Their relationship was over a casualty of his catastrophic miscalculation. Alexander nodded numbly. His own phone had begun buzzing incessantly in his pocket, no doubt his father already receiving word of what had transpired. He couldn't bring himself to answer it yet. How could he explain that he had torpedoed the family business because he couldn't resist putting a random woman in her place? Back inside the aircraft, Naomi returned to her seat and reopened her book, but the words on the page remained unfocused as she processed what had just occurred. Ambassador Wilson moved to sit across from her. "That couldn't have been easy," he said quietly. "But it was necessary." Naomi nodded. "Leadership isn't about making easy choices. It's about making right ones even when they're difficult." Dr. Vasquez approached now, concern evident in her expression. "Naomi, are you sure about this? The Blackwell acquisition would have accelerated our production timeline significantly. It would also have brought a toxic culture into our organization," Naomi replied. "We'll find another way to expand manufacturing capacity, one that doesn't compromise our values." Jasmine approached with a glass of water. "We're cleared for takeoff whenever you're ready, Ms. Reynolds." Naomi took a sip of water and gazed out the window. On the tarmac below, she could see Alexander and Victoria being escorted to the terminal building, their figures growing smaller with distance. "Let's go," she said finally. "I have a friend waiting for me in Aspen and important decisions to make about the future of a lot of good people who deserve better leadership." Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for departure. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened as we prepare for takeoff." As Horizon 1 lifted into the clear blue sky, leaving Alexander Blackwell and his shattered arrogance on the ground, Naomi returned to the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, finding solace in words written almost 2 millennia earlier. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. But even as the aircraft climbed, she was already thinking ahead. 5,000 people worked for Blackwell Industries. 5,000 families depended on paychecks from a company whose leadership had failed them. She wouldn't pursue the acquisition, but perhaps there was another way to preserve what was valuable while excising what was toxic. She opened her laptop and began to type. By the time they reached cruising altitude, the outline of a new plan was taking shape, one that might save Blackwell's employees without saving Alexander Blackwell himself. Within hours of Alexander Blackwell's disastrous encounter on Naomi Reynolds' private jet, the financial world began to rumble with speculation. By the time he and Victoria landed in Aspen on a commercial flight middle seats in economy, the only last-minute tickets available, his phone was flooded with frantic messages. Breaking Horizon Innovations withdraws. Offer for Blackwell Industries. The headline screamed across financial news outlets worldwide. Blackwell's stock plummeted 37% in afternoon trading, triggering circuit breakers and temporarily halting transactions. When trading resumed, the free fall continued. Investors already nervous about the company's precarious finances rushed for the exits. In their Manhattan penthouse, Richard Blackwell stared at his phone in disbelief as he read his son's halting explanation. The acquisition had been the company's last hope, a lifeline thrown to a once great institution now drowning in debt and outdated business models. Without it, bankruptcy loomed inevitably on the horizon. "What did you do?" he whispered into the phone, his voice hollow with shock. What could you possibly have done to derail years of planning in a single plane ride? Alexander had no answer that didn't sound pathetic even to his own ears. How could he explain that he had torpedoed the family legacy because he couldn't resist mocking a woman he assumed was beneath him, that his reflexive cruelty had cost 5,000 people their livelihoods? "Dad, I made a mistake. I didn't know who she was." The silence that followed was deafening. When Richard finally spoke, his voice had aged a decade in minutes. "That's your defense, that you would have treated her differently if you'd known she was important." His breathing was labored, each word an effort. "We raised you to be better than this, Alexander. Or at least we tried." The disappointment in his father's voice cut deeper than anger would have. Alexander had spent his life chasing his father's approval, always falling short, always compensating with bravado and entitlement. Now, at last, Richard was seeing him clearly, and the vision was devastating. "I'll fix this," Alexander insisted, though he had no idea how. "I'll call her, apologize properly. She can't really walk away from a deal this size because of one misunderstanding." Richard's laugh was bitter, tinged with the wisdom of someone who had built an empire through relationships rather than intimidation. "Son, you still don't understand. People like Naomi Reynolds don't need our business. She can afford principals because she's built something substantial. We're the ones who needed her, and you just showed her exactly why she shouldn't want us." The truth of his father's assessment hit Alexander like a physical blow. For the first time, he saw himself as others must see him, not the confident executive he pretended to be, but a hollow man propped up by inherited privilege. Meanwhile, Victoria disappeared from his side the moment they landed in Aspen, citing a previous engagement that hadn't existed hours earlier. By evening, she had quietly removed all photos of Alexander from her Instagram account and was seen dining with a European tech investor at an exclusive restaurant. Her defection shouldn't have surprised him. Their relationship had been transactional from the beginning. She gained social status, he acquired an attractive accessory. The moment his value plummeted, she had moved on without a backward glance. For Alexander, the fall was vertiginous. Within a week, he was called before the Blackwell Industries board to explain his role in the failed acquisition. The meeting was brief and merciless. Mr. Blackwell said, "Janet Morris, the lead independent director, your actions have resulted in the single greatest destruction of shareholder value in this company's history. The board has lost confidence in your judgment." Alexander sat alone at the end of the long table, his father conspicuously absent due to the heart condition that had suddenly become genuinely concerning. The other directors, men and women who had once laughed at his jokes and courted his favor, now regarded him with barely concealed contempt. By the meeting's conclusion, he was removed from his executive position and stripped of decision-making authority. His father, eyes red-rimmed and voice raspy, couldn't even look at him as the votes were tallied. "You'll retain your title until the press release," Janet informed him. "But you'll clean out your office today. Security will assist you." The humiliation was complete. Alexander Blackwell, who had spent his life believing he was untouchable, was being escorted from his own family's company by security guards. Employees who had feared him now watched openly as he carried a cardboard box to the elevator, whispers following in his wake. In the weeks that followed, Alexander's world contracted at a dizzying rate. Friends stopped returning his calls. Invitations dried up. His regular table at exclusive restaurants was suddenly unavailable. The social infrastructure that had supported his ego for decades collapsed like a house of cards. Have you ever witnessed someone face the consequences of their own arrogance? That moment when reality crashes down and everything they took for granted disappears? Share your stories of karmic justice in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you believe in the power of dignity and respect. Throughout Blackwell Industries, the news of the collapsed acquisition spread like wildfire. In executive suites, panic reigned as leaders scrambled to find alternative financing or buyers. In middle management, resumes were hastily updated and sent out to competitors. But on the manufacturing floor, among the thousands of workers whose livelihoods hung in the balance, the mood was something closer to resigned despair. Many had worked for Blackwell for decades, their entire adult lives spent building products that had once been industry standards. They had weathered previous downturns, had accepted pay freezes and benefit cuts to help the company through rough patches. But this was different. This was existential. In the employee cafeteria, conversations centered on rumors and contingency plans. Families with children in college wondered how they would manage tuition payments. Workers nearing retirement calculated whether their diminished pensions would be enough to live on. Younger employees debated whether to wait it out or jump ship immediately. Maria Hernandez, who had worked on the assembly line for 22 years, summed up the collective mood. "We built this company with our hands, but they destroyed it with their arrogance." 3 months after the incident, the full circle of consequence completed itself. With no buyer and creditors calling in loans, Blackwell Industries filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The once proud Blackwell name was now associated with catastrophic failure. The bankruptcy proceedings were covered extensively in the business press. Financial analysts dissected the company's decline, pointing to years of mismanagement, failure to innovate, and excessive executive compensation. Alexander's name featured prominently in these postmortems, his disastrous encounter with Naomi Reynolds becoming a business school case study in how personal conduct could destroy corporate value. In one particularly devastating article titled "The High Cost of Arrogance," the Wall Street Journal detailed how Alexander's behavior had been the final straw for a potential acquirer who had already harbored reservations about Blackwell's corporate culture. Alexander, unemployed and increasingly unmarketable due to the rumors circulating in executive circles, retreated to a rented condo in Florida. His assets frozen by litigation. His reputation in tatters, he eventually took the only job he could find behind the counter at a luxury car rental agency where he handed keys to the same type of people he once was. The irony wasn't lost on him. Luxury wheels catered to wealthy travelers, people who expected deference, demanded special treatment, and rarely bothered to learn the names of service staff. Alexander, who had once been one of those travelers, now stood on the other side of the counter, invisible except when needed. Each morning, as he put on his company polo shirt, he relived those fatal 14 minutes on Naomi's plane. Each time he forced a smile for a customer who treated him like furniture, he tasted the bitter medicine of his own making. The first time a client snapped fingers at him and demanded better service, Alexander nearly quit on the spot. But he needed the job, needed the modest paycheck to cover rent on his one-bedroom apartment. So he swallowed his pride and apologized for the delay, just as countless service workers had apologized to him throughout his privileged life. Slowly, painfully, Alexander Blackwell was learning what it meant to be judged by appearance rather than substance, to be dismissed without consideration, to be treated as a function rather than a person. It was a harsh education, but perhaps a necessary one. But while Alexander Blackwell's world collapsed, Naomi Reynolds was building something new from the ashes of what might have been. Rather than acquiring Blackwell Industries outright, she created the Horizon Foundation with an initial investment of $200 million. Its first major project, the Professor Thomas Blackwood Center for STEM Innovation, a state-of-the-art facility providing scholarships and mentorship to underprivileged students pursuing careers in science and engineering. The center wasn't just a building. It was a testament to Naomi's vision of inclusive innovation. Its stunning glass facade, designed by a renowned Black architect, featured solar-collecting panels developed by Horizon's engineering team. Inside laboratories equipped with cutting-edge technology sat alongside collaborative spaces designed to foster community and creative thinking. A massive atrium filled with natural light housed an interactive exhibition on environmental sustainability, free and open to the public. Every aspect of the facility embodied Naomi's belief that science should serve humanity, not just corporate interests. The center embodied everything Naomi had learned from her mentor, the belief that talent existed everywhere, but opportunity did not. That education was the great equalizer, and that diversity of perspective led to better science and technology. It would train the next generation of innovators, particularly focused on students from backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in STEM fields. More significantly for the former Blackwell employees, Horizon Innovations directly hired over 2,000 of the company's most talented engineers, designers, and factory workers. The remaining employees received severance packages and job placement assistance, far beyond what bankruptcy proceedings would have provided. Naomi had kept her word. She protected the people while holding leadership accountable. Rather than acquiring Blackwell's outdated facilities, Horizon Innovations built new state-of-the-art manufacturing centers in the same communities, ensuring that the economic impact remained local. These facilities incorporated advanced green technology, dramatically reducing carbon emissions compared to the older Blackwell plants. When asked by reporters why she had walked away from the acquisition, she never mentioned Alexander or his behavior. Her official statement was simple. Due diligence revealed fundamental incompatibilities in leadership philosophy and corporate values. We found a better way to integrate the talents we admired while leaving behind the elements that didn't align with Horizon's mission. The business press praised her decision as both ethical and strategic. Harvard Business Review published a case study titled "When to Walk Away: Horizon's Value-Based Decision-Making," which became required reading in MBA programs across the country. Richard Blackwell, despite losing control of his company, received the medical care he needed through a private arrangement with Horizon's healthcare division. The heart condition Alexander had mentioned was real, though less dire than his son had implied. With proper treatment, the elder Blackwell eventually recovered enough to start a small consulting practice, rebuilding his life on a more modest scale. He never publicly criticized his son, maintaining family loyalty even as their empire crumbled. But privately, the relationship had suffered irreparable damage. Their conversations became perfunctory, limited to necessary exchanges about legal matters related to the bankruptcy. The easy camaraderie they had once shared, built around shared privilege and power, could not survive in their new reality. One slow Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after his world had imploded, Alexander retreated to the employee break room of Luxury Wheels, the rental agency where he now worked. The room was a small windowless box that smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. He sank into a wobbly plastic chair, the linoleum floor cold beneath his thin-soled shoes. On a small television bolted to the wall, a local news program droned on, providing a meaningless flicker of color and sound. He stared at it without seeing it, his mind a dull hum of exhaustion. He was replaying the morning in his head. A customer had yelled at him for 10 minutes because the requested midsize SUV wasn't available. Alexander had simply stood there absorbing the rage until a manager intervened. It was a scene that would have been inconceivable in his old life. Now it was just Tuesday. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the wall. Then a name cut through the noise, a name that made the fine hairs on his arm stand up. And here in Aspen, a major philanthropic announcement from Horizon Innovations. Alexander's eyes snapped open. His heart began to hammer against his ribs like a frantic trapped bird. The news anchor was standing in the brilliant mountain sun in front of a stunningly modern glass and steel building. And then the camera panned to the group at the podium. It was her Naomi Reynolds. She looked exactly as he remembered her from the plane, not dressed in overt luxury, but in an impeccably tailored navy blue dress that spoke of quiet confidence. Her hair was styled in the same elegant braids. She stood with serene, unshakable poise that seemed to draw all the light and attention toward her. Beside her in a wheelchair sat a frail but beaming elderly man, Professor Blackwood Alexander assumed. The reporter's voice continued. Tech billionaire and Horizon CEO Naomi Reynolds was here today to dedicate the Professor Thomas Blackwood Center for STEM Innovation, a state-of-the-art facility she funded to provide scholarships and mentorship for underprivileged students hoping to enter the fields of science and engineering. Alexander felt cold dread mixed with morbid, paralyzing curiosity. He couldn't look away. He watched as Naomi leaned down to say something to Blackwood, who smiled and placed a hand on her arm. It was a moment of profound, genuine connection. Then the reporter delivered the blow. It came not as a shout, but as a calm, professionally delivered piece of context that landed on Alexander with the force of a physical impact. When asked about the massive $200 million donation, Reynolds' office noted that a recent decision to cancel a major corporate acquisition freed up significant capital, and Miss Reynolds felt there was no better use for it than investing in the next generation of innovators. The air left Alexander's lungs in a single ragged gasp. He felt the cheap plastic chair beneath him sway, as if the very ground had become unstable. A recent decision to cancel a major corporate acquisition. It wasn't just any acquisition. It was his acquisition. It was Blackwell Industries. The money that was supposed to be the lifeline for his family, the capital that was meant to save their legacy, had not just disappeared into the ether. It had been rerouted, transmuted. His family's catastrophic failure had become the seed money for this beautiful, hopeful place. The ashes of his world had been used as fertilizer for hers. The karma was so precise, so poetically, devastatingly complete that it took his breath away. Naomi stepped to the podium to speak, and the broadcast carried her calm, clear voice into the miserable little break room. "True wealth isn't measured by what you own," she began, and every word was a surgical instrument dissecting Alexander's soul. "It's measured by what you contribute. It's about building bridges, not walls. It's about lifting people up, not putting them down. Lifting people up, not putting them down." The image of himself standing over her on the jet, sneering, flashed in his mind with searing clarity. Character, respect, humility. These are the only currencies that truly matter. She continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of bright-faced students who were the center's first scholarship recipients. They are the values my mentor, Professor Blackwood, taught me, and they are the values on which this center is built. The broadcast cut away to B-roll of the students, but Alexander could still see her face in his mind. He finally understood. The entire horrifying encounter on the jet had been a test he didn't know he was taking. He had revealed his character and, by extension, the character of the company he represented. He had shown her a fundamental lack of respect, a complete absence of humility, and she had made her decision based on that currency, the only one she truly valued. He had laughed at her seat, believing her place in a chair defined her place in the world. He now saw that he was the one who was small, trapped in the cramped, uncomfortable seat of his own character. Naomi Reynolds owned the jet. Yes, but that was a trivial detail. What she truly owned was her life, her principles, her unassailable power, a power that came not from a name she had inherited, but from a mind she had cultivated and a character she had forged. His power had been an illusion, a fragile construct of money and privilege. Hers was real. The news segment ended, transitioning to a fluffy piece about a skiing dog. The bright, idiotic music filled the silence, a stark contrast to the profound, silent ruin in Alexander's heart. He sat there for a long time, the television's cheerful noise washing over him. He thought of his father, aging rapidly in a rented condo much like his own. He thought of Victoria, who, according to a gossip site he'd hate-read one night, was now planning a wedding to a European tech investor. And he thought of himself here in this break room, a man stripped of everything but the agonizing clarity of his own failure. He had learned his lesson. It was a lesson he would carry with him every single day for the rest of his life. Every time he handed keys to a stranger, every time he forced a smile and swallowed his pride, it was a lesson that had cost him everything. His manager's voice broke through his reverie. "Break's over, Blackwell. We've got a line forming out there." Alexander nodded mechanically. Back to the counter. Back to the customers who would look through him rather than at him. Back to a life he had never imagined possible just 6 months ago. Slowly, mechanically, he pushed himself up from the chair and walked back to the counter. Back to his new life, forever living in the quiet shadow of the day he tried to tell a queen to move from her throne. 5 months after the confrontation on the private jet, Naomi Reynolds sat beside Professor Thomas Blackwood's hospital bed. The cancer had progressed rapidly, but his mind remained sharp, his eyes still bright with the curiosity that had defined his life in science. Was it vengeance, he asked quietly as they discussed the Blackwell incident which he had eventually coaxed from her? Or Principal Naomi considered the question carefully, knowing that in his final days her mentor deserved nothing less than complete honesty. Both, I think, she admitted. I was angry not just for myself, but for every person who's ever been dismissed, diminished, or disrespected based on appearance. But anger alone wouldn't have been enough to cancel a strategically valuable acquisition. Blackwood nodded. His breathing labored, but his focus intense. "And the principal, I couldn't bring that toxicity into Horizon," she said. "We've built something different, a place where innovation thrives, because people feel valued regardless of title or background. Alexander Blackwell would have poisoned that. And his behavior showed me that the rot extended beyond him, that it was likely embedded in the company culture." She thought back to her own early career, the countless times she'd been dismissed, ignored, or underestimated. The venture capitalist who had asked her if she was the assistant when she came to pitch. The conference organizer who had directed her to the catering entrance rather than the speaker's check-in. The executive who had patted her on the head, literally, and told her that her ideas were cute. Each of those experiences had shaped her, had informed her commitment to building a different kind of company. Horizon Innovations was her answer to a business world that too often confused arrogance with competence, entitlement with authority. And the Senator Blackwood asked, "Is that your way of balancing the scales?" Naomi smiled gently. "It's my way of creating something meaningful from a painful encounter. The students we're supporting now, they're brilliant, hungry for opportunity. They'll create things neither you nor I could imagine. That seems a better legacy than corporate acquisition for acquisition's sake." The Blackwood Center had already accepted its first cohort of 50 students selected from thousands of applicants nationwide. They came from communities often overlooked by traditional STEM recruitment: inner cities, rural areas, tribal lands. What they shared was extraordinary potential and limited resources. The center provided not just full scholarships but comprehensive support, including mentorship, housing, healthcare, and career placement. Blackwood's eyes filled with tears. "My greatest discovery," he whispered, "wasn't in physics at all. It was seeing the potential in a shy graduate student who questioned everything." Naomi took his hand, her own eyes glistening. "You taught me that power isn't about controlling others. It's about lifting them up so they can discover their own strength." That was the lesson Alexander Blackwell had never learned: that true power wasn't demonstrated by putting others down, but by helping them rise. It was the fundamental difference in philosophy that had made the acquisition impossible, regardless of the financial benefits. As Professor Blackwood drifted into sleep, Naomi remained by his side, reflecting on how a single encounter on a private jet had cascaded into consequences that would ripple through countless lives for generations. The Professor Thomas Blackwood Center was already thriving, with its first class of 50 scholarship students making remarkable progress. Many came from backgrounds like her own, talented but lacking resources, hungry for opportunity and mentorship. When people asked why she had invested so much in education rather than further corporate expansion, she often quoted her mentor: "The returns on human potential far outpace any market investment." For the students, the center was transformative. Darius Washington, raised by a single mother in South Chicago, was developing a breakthrough algorithm for predicting climate change impacts on urban infrastructure. Maria Gonzalez, whose parents were migrant farm workers in California, had created a prototype for water purification that used 80% less energy than existing systems. Jamal Lewis from rural Mississippi was pioneering new approaches to sustainable agriculture that could revolutionize food production in developing nations. These students represented the future Naomi envisioned, one where talent and determination mattered more than privilege and connections. They were the living embodiment of her belief that diversity of perspective led to better innovation, that the answers to humanity's most pressing problems would come from unexpected places, if only we bothered to look. More subtly, the encounter with Alexander had transformed Horizon's approach to acquisitions and hiring. Naomi implemented what staff now called the Blackwell Protocol, a series of unannounced interactions with leadership candidates in situations where they believed they were speaking with someone of lower status. Character revealed in those moments became as important as credentials in final decisions. This approach had already prevented several potential hiring disasters. One executive candidate with an impeccable resume had been eliminated after berating a receptionist who was actually Horizon's head of human resources participating in the protocol. Another had lost a potential board seat after making dismissive comments about diversity hires to someone he assumed was a junior staff member but who was actually Naomi's chief diversity officer. The protocol had become so successful that other companies had begun adopting similar practices, leading to a gradual shift in corporate culture across multiple industries. Business journals had written extensively about the approach, dubbing it the Horizon Method, and praising its effectiveness in identifying authentic leadership qualities. And what of Alexander Blackwell? Naomi had kept tabs on him not from vindictiveness, but from a genuine interest in whether people could change when confronted with the consequences of their actions. Reports suggested he was still working at the luxury car rental agency, still living a life unrecognizable from his former existence. But there were whispers of change, small acts of kindness toward coworkers, a growing humility, a man slowly rebuilding himself from the ground up. Naomi hoped those rumors were true. Transformation, after all, had always been at the heart of her own story. 3 days later, Professor Thomas Blackwood passed peacefully in his sleep, At his memorial service, attended by colleagues, former students, and the first cohort of scholarship recipients from the center bearing his name, Naomi delivered a eulogy that spoke not just to his scientific achievements, but to his profound understanding of human dignity. Thomas believed that how we treat each other matters more than what we achieve. She said, her voice steady, despite her grief. He taught me that true power isn't about how loudly you can speak or how much space you can take up. It's about the impact you leave when you walk away. As she left the podium, her gaze passed over the young scholarship students in attendance. Bright minds from backgrounds society often overlooked. In their eyes, she saw the same hunger for knowledge, the same determination that had driven her own journey from a Baltimore row house to the helm of a global technology company. This was Professor Blackwood's true legacy, not just in the building that bore his name, but in the chain of mentorship and opportunity that would continue long after both of them were gone. And in an unexpected way, it was also the legacy of a 14-minute encounter with a man who had judged her based on appearance and found himself harshly judged in return by the standards that truly mattered. 1 year to the day after that fateful flight, Naomi received an unexpected letter. It had been forwarded through several channels before reaching her desk, suggesting the sender had gone to some length to ensure it arrived. The return address was unfamiliar, but the name wasn't Alexander Blackwell. She considered not opening it. What could he possibly say that would matter now but curiosity, the same quality that had driven her scientific career, won out? The letter was handwritten, the penmanship precise despite a slight tremor evident in the lines. "Ms. Reynolds," it began, "I have drafted this letter a dozen times, searching for words that might convey genuine remorse rather than self-pity. I'm not sure such words exist, but I'll attempt it anyway. A year ago, I revealed my character to you in 14 minutes of breathtaking arrogance. You made a business decision based on that revelation, one that in retrospect was entirely correct. I wasn't worthy of partnership with what you've built. I won't claim that losing everything has been a gift. It hasn't. It's been painful, humiliating, and entirely deserved. But it has been educational. For the first time in my life, I'm experiencing the world without the buffer of privilege, seeing how people like me treated people like I am now. I'm writing not to ask for forgiveness or opportunity. I've forfeited any right to either. I'm writing because I saw a feature about the Blackwood Center, about the students you're supporting, and I wanted you to know that the money you might have spent acquiring our failing company has gone to something immeasurably better. My father, who is doing well, thanks to the medical care you arranged, speaks often of missed opportunities, not financial ones, but chances to build something meaningful rather than merely profitable. I think he sees in you the leader I could never be. I don't know if people can truly change. I hope so. I'm trying to. Not to reclaim what I lost, but because I finally understand what my father meant when he said there are more important things than power and position. With respect and genuine admiration, Alexander Blackwell. Naomi folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't respond. Some conversations were complete without continuation, but she felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that sometimes consequences could lead to consciousness. True power isn't about how loudly you can speak or how much space you can take up. It's about the impact you leave when you walk away. Naomi Reynolds didn't need to announce her power. She demonstrated it through action. And in doing so, she didn't just change one man's life. She transformed an entire community's future. Next time someone underestimates you based on your appearance, remember this story. Let them judge the cover while you write the chapters. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room isn't just the most powerful, they're the one who owns the building. If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button right now and share it with someone who needs this message today. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories of dignity and justice to light. Drop a comment below telling us about a time you were underestimated and how you responded. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our new videos about people who turn judgment into opportunity. Remember, the best revenge isn't getting even, it's rising above.